The Biden administration is flip-flopping on a campaign trail promise they made as it relates to the war on drugs. We're going to be breaking that down a little bit as it relates to addiction and trauma as well. And to help us break this down is David Helfrich. David, what's going on with this story?
What's going on, Joe? How you doing today? It's good to be with you. So what happened here is basically we've got roughly 4,500 people who were released from federal prison, sent to home confinement starting around April of 2020. This was part of a DOJ directive aimed at preventing transmission of COVID-19 in federal prisons. So a lot of these people, keep in mind, were imprisoned in the first place for nonviolent drug charges, including marijuana possession and distribution. And the status of these people has been in question since late 2020, when the Trump DOJ issued a memo stating that people whose sentences would outlast the COVID-19 emergency would be required to return to prison. So you can imagine a lot of these people who were in prison for drug offenses are now in home confinement, kind of nervously waiting to be sent back to prison, which is, a difficult situation for anybody. But what's interesting is that the Biden administration was supposed to reverse course on this, but its lawyers actually concluded that the Trump administration correctly interpreted the law here, and that thousands of people now in home confinement, including those with marijuana charges, must be returned to prison at the end of the pandemic emergency period. So this position from the Biden administration is perplexing for many reasons, mainly for those of us who remember his promise when he was campaigning for president to where he would loosen a lot of these drug laws. He actually said, quote unquote, anyone who has a marijuana record should be let out of jail. And he also promised to broadly use his clemency powers for certain nonviolent and drug crimes, such as marijuana distribution. So this reversal from Biden may not be such of a surprise for many of us who remember the days of him being a staunch drug warrior. Biden often bragged about the draconian sentences he helped enact in the 80s and 90s. And this is a position which is really grossly out of touch with where the American people are at. Sort of regardless of your political affiliation and identity, a recent Quinnipiac University poll showed that the vast majority of Americans actually support legalization of marijuana at this time. It is already legal in 19 states. From a recreational perspective, it's legal in 18 states, including the District of Columbia. And so, barring an executive intervention from Biden, many of these people who are now in home confinement because of drug charges, including marijuana, will be returned to prison at the end of this pandemic emergency period.
Right. So, this is interesting because it feels like a lot of this stuff, and I mean, we go back to his earlier, measures that he was taking, or he was in support of, you should say, back in the day. I mean, this a lot has to do with what has often been called the war on drugs, right? Which, I think has always been up in the air as has this really ever done anything to actually help the situation? And I think we should dive a little bit more into that in just a second. But, this war on drugs, from the standpoint of policy, I mean, what have you seen this do over the course of time?
Well, it's interesting because when we look at the war on drugs, it hasn't solved any of the problems, whether it was designed to solve problems of people being addicted to drugs or drugs getting into our communities. It's arguably done the exact opposite. I think we have more drug use, more addiction now than we've had previously after spending trillions of dollars and locking up thousands of people who really shouldn't be in prison. We really haven't had a focus on rehabilitation. If you're sending somebody to prison who's addicted to a drug, the chances of them getting better is almost nil, particularly when there's no emphasis on rehabilitating their addiction or integrating them back into society after they serve their time. So this, for-profit prison system, and also, the connection that we have with law enforcement and the CIA, who arguably have been involved in drug running itself, creates a very sticky situation where, unfortunately, a lot of vulnerable communities, people of color in particular, have taken the brunt of this and been imprisoned for when they really should be out in their community in a rehabilitative situation.
Yeah, we see a lot of sort of that conflict of interest between the public policy and the private prison systems, whereby, if you can bring in the drugs and give them to people, and if you can create these hardcore measures, you just keep packing people into prisons for nonviolent crimes and even things that, I mean, most people do but just never get caught for, like having some marijuana in your home or something like that, right? But this leads to the bigger question, right? Let's dive into kind of the deeper part of this, which is obviously when we're talking about drug use, when we're talking about even recreational drug use or alcohol or any of these things, if there's addiction involved, which I mean, we can argue what addiction is in terms of how much do you need to consume for it to be an addiction, whatever that looks like. But oftentimes we're dealing with people that are hurting in some way, shape, or form. Their life circumstances, their life experience has led them to this point. And it feels like this war on drugs is not addressing that at all. And I think this is why there's a big discussion around this hasn't done anything. The demand is still very high. So no matter who you try and bust, the demand for these drugs is still very high. So do we need a holistic approach looking at, how we can help these people with addiction? What are your thoughts on that?
Without question. And also there's an issue just in terms of our criminal justice system, how we classify drug use. So fentanyl, for example, is scheduled in the same classification as marijuana, which obviously there's medicinal benefits to marijuana. Fentanyl is a very dangerous addictive substance. So the notion that you're basically classifying these drugs together is a problem in itself. But to your point, someone who's addicted to fentanyl is not going to get any better by being thrown in handcuffs and being thrown in prison, where in an environment where their addictions are likely going to be exacerbated. So, without any system of looking at our criminal justice system, where it's going wrong, where we're currently investing money in, and sending people instead to rehabilitative clinics, health clinics, holistic clinics where they can deal with their addictions and they can get back into society and be productive members of their community, that would be a far better social investment than continuing the war on drugs and imprisoning people and putting them behind bars for nonviolent crimes when they really should not even be there in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting because even a lot of addiction experts, I see a quote here from American Addiction Centers, talking about how, we're losing the war on drugs. Nothing's happening. It's not doing anything because we're not actually trying to assess where the root problem is, which is actually lowering the demand for drugs, which is addressing the people. Why are they hurting? Why are they in pain? And, I think about my own experience. I've never really been much of a drinker per se, and I've never really dove into recreational drugs in my experience. But, back in like 2010 or so, I basically had pretty much stopped drinking alcohol, almost carte blanche. I was not drinking it a whole lot to begin with, but I had stopped, and that went on for many, many years until, I accumulated a great deal of stress in my work life and everything that has happened through, censorship and having to pivot our business in such a big way. And going through that, I noticed that, throughout 2020 and into, the later parts of 2020, that was where my interest was in having a drink again. I suddenly would have these thoughts, these feelings of like, I want to have a drink. And the more I explored this accumulated stress, which really was what ends up being trauma in my body, the more I realized that what was happening in my body was I was wanting to have relief from the constant tension, the constant survival mode feeling as though there's something like almost like my body's against me, right? And this is just accumulated stress. This is from what happened to me in my life. And now I'm not here to say, okay, well, my experience is so much better or worse or whatever from somebody else. It's more so looking at understanding what happens to people is such an important part of understanding how we can actually help the situation. And it feels like this point of view is not considered enough. And, just from my own experience of having that single drink, having like one cider, for example, would give me this sort of relief in my body that made me feel like, oh, okay, that stress that had been accumulated that I had not experienced before in my life per se to this degree was a big thing. And it took me having to do a lot of work on my nervous system, a lot of work on my trauma to sort of reset things, which we talk a lot about on the Collective Evolution channel, for me to start feeling better. And I wanted to offer that experience as, again, I'm not saying that people who have a much more severe situations perhaps require a deeper level of assistance. But, how do we go there? How do we help with that particular situation from your perspective?
Yeah, Joe, first of all, it's a very deep share. Appreciate you for sharing that experience. But I think you hit something very important in that people who are dealing with drug addiction are looking for a sense of relief in the body. For them, in many ways, this is the last outlet to try to cope with the stresses that people deal with on a daily basis. Obviously, those stressors are now more intense than ever in the situation we're currently in. And people are looking to drug use to try to alleviate some of those stressors. So I think we have to pivot in our mindset as a society to not look at this as a criminal issue, but more of a holistic mental and physical health issue. There have even been studies in countries who look at addiction more of it as a health issue than a criminal justice issue. And they actually invite addicts to come into their clinics They even give them like a micro dose of something just to calm them down, and so that they can actually treat them and deal with the issue head on and let those people know that they're cared for, as opposed to those people being driven underground and afraid of being in handcuffs and thrown behind prison bars. So it's not a productive way to deal with addiction or our drug problems. You know, the war on drugs has now been conducted for multiple decades, even a half century. It's been an abject failure. It's time for us to try something else.
Indeed, yeah. It's almost coming to a deeper understanding of who we are as humans and how we function and what's going on, and understanding that people aren't necessarily they're not choosing to be what they are today per se. I mean, a lot of what happens to us creates an experience in our nervous system that becomes almost automatic in a lot of ways. And recognizing that that's how the physiology is functioning allows us to connect with each other in a much better way. And perhaps, as you alluded to, and I think a lot of people in the trauma world are alluding to, this is kind of the way forward. Do you feel that the government in their current mindset would ever make a shift to this sort of thing?
I do think so, because if you look at some isolated situations and jurisdictions, some places in California, some places even in the District of Columbia, they've decriminalized not only the drugs we're talking about, but psychedelic drugs as well, where there's now pretty spirited debate about what type of medicinal utility there is for these psychedelics that previously were just regarded as street drugs. So I think there is a shift. There is a movement to look at this differently, but we still have a long way to go, unfortunately.
Well, as always, appreciate your report and insight here, David.
Of course, good to be with you, Joe.
So that's all.